So I've asked the chair for a little bit of extra time, about 20 minutes to speak. As all of you know, I do prefer nuanced answers, and I have an aversion to yes/no answers, especially after recent events. So I'll need a bit of time to kind of unpack my answer, and I think it's going to take. I'm going to talk about two parts, right? Can Singapore do a Malaysia? Two parts to my answer. The first is to focus more on structural, institutional issues in Singapore in comparison to Malaysia. And I think the second is to focus more on the different nature of politics in the two states. Right? So the first thing we need to talk about, really, I think, is to actually compare Singapore and Malaysian systems, right? And in particular, the sort of political economy of social control in the two countries. And also how Singapore has differed historically from the Federation of Malaya and Malaysia. And for the purposes of this discussion, I'm focusing on West Malaysia. I'm not really going to touch much on Sabah and Sarawak. So the first point I want to make is that the alliance and the successor Barisan Nasional has never had a monopoly of power the way the PAP has a monopoly of power. Right? At the federal level, for example, in 1955, the first general election, the alliance, you're all familiar with the alliance, right? I'm assuming most of you have this knowledge. So if I use terms that confuse people, just feel free to put up your hand and stop me. So the alliance in the first general election won 51 out of 52 seats, right? And even then, right, that is the high watermark. So it's never had a clean sweep the way the PAP has ever had. But even then, the alliance up to that point in time had lost seats at the local and state levels. So it never had a clean sweep at any of the different levels of government. And its share of the vote and its share of the seats have gone down, it's gone up, but it has never reached this high watermark of every seat but one that was established in 1955. And indeed, as I've pointed out before in other forums, there's a very good chance that if the PAP had not taken Singapore out of Malaysia in 65, that the alliance would have outright lost the 69 election, right? Because the final result there was Alliance 74, Opposition Party 70. And if Singapore was part of Malaysia, well, there were 15 seats in Singapore. So any majority party in Singapore, 8 out of the 15 seats, could have joined the opposition and they would have then had more seats than the alliance. So it's entirely plausible that the BN could have, alliance could have lost in 1969. And it's responded to these different instances of coming close to losing power in similar ways to the PAP, in that it's clamped down and tried to cement its hold on power. So, for example, as it kept losing local council elections, the alliance eventually simply abolished local council elections in 1965 and replaced them with appointed positions, right? And to this day, local councils are still appointed, right? Despite there was a royal commission which recommended the return of elections to local councils, but that hasn't happened. That was the commission met, I think they published their report in 67. And then, of course, the alliance lost many times, and BN has lost many times at the state level, right? Kelantan, Terengganu. And then when it nearly lost power in 69, well, riots broke out, and all of you are familiar with 13th May, and the alliance suspended the parliament for 2 years, during which time it enacted a lot of changes, shifted the sort of basis of policy in Malaysia. We had NEP, the Rukun Negara was introduced, PAS changed quite drastically in that time. And so by 1974, UMNO had convinced PAS and Gerakan to join it in the new Barisan Nasional. And so my point here is very straightforward, that the BN and its predecessor alliance has never had the kind of monopoly of power that the PAP enjoys. Malaysia is just too big, too diverse, too many layers of government to ever monopolize power at any level. right? You compare it to the PAP in Singapore. One of the very first things the PAP did when they got into power in 1959 was to abolish local government, right? The city council, the rural council, they were immediately abolished and their powers folded into national government. And then over time, it steadily removed the independence of many other institutions. Right, the PAP removed the independence of other institutions in Singapore, or created new institutions like the People's Association, which was firmly under the control of the Prime Minister. So they destroyed the independence of the press, for example. They put all media under government control. We have no Malaysia Kini equivalent, even though, of course, we have tried very hard. And Terry is here; he will know how hard we've tried to have a free and independent media in Singapore. Other potential sources of opposition in Singapore: lawyers, religious organizations, Chinese schools, trade unions, right? They've all been successfully co-opted or destroyed, but these organizations, to a greater or lesser degree, still exist in Malaysia with greater amounts of independence than in Singapore. So the Sydney Morning Herald, right, recently wrote, and I quote here, "The PAP keeps an iron grip on power through the velvet glove of the court system and control of the media and the web. In particular, pliable judges operate a draconian defamation law that crushes critics and opponents. It has all the trappings of a liberal democracy, but not much of its substance. The best exemplar of a liberal authoritarian state." Now, I have to say here at this point, they say, I don't say, right? Okay. And the fact that I have to say that is them saying, and I'm not endorsing what they're saying, also reflects the issues that we face in Singapore regarding freedom of speech. So Malaysia has never had it as bad as that, right? Your institutions have more independence, your lawyers have more independence, your law society was never crushed. It's co-opted the way the Singapore Law Society was crushed. Your Chinese schools still exist. Your religious organizations, I mean, way more power than the ones in Singapore. And Singapore has no traditional social or cultural elite the way Malaysia does, right? You have the sultans and what they represent. We set aside any sort of political issue or religious issue. Just from the wealth of the sultans and the social, cultural role that they occupy creates, it makes them an alternative power base to the government. Just their existence alone, right? So you have all these different centers of power in Malaysia, but in Singapore, everything has been centralized and brought under the cabinet. We only have one layer of government, not three, not even two, just one, right? One source of power. By 1968, because they arrested opposition politicians, detained them without trial, banished them from the country, or just scared people into leaving politics, by 1968, the PAP had a complete clean sweep every single seat in parliament, and they had that all the way until 81. That has never happened in Malaysia, right? In Malaysia, at every single round of elections, at every level, at least one opposition, at least one seat has been won by an opposition somewhere. So I mentioned 81, right? And that's when things got even worse for Singapore. Because on top of all of this that I've just described, in the 80s, the system was drastically changed in response to increasing public discontent, right? The PAP went through a number of very serious policy failures. And in response, the people of Anson elected Joshua Benjamin Jeyaretnam and then later Cham Si Tong. And so in response, the PAP fundamentally changed the nature of the electoral system to make it less representative of the people and their popular will. All right, this is something I've talked a lot about elsewhere, so you can see my talks on YouTube. But to summarize, if the fundamental purpose of an election is to reveal or reflect the popular will of the people, right, then our elections, Singapore's elections, are a massive failure because they are heavily unfair. They are free, right? In the sense that when you go in the ballot box and the ballot's in front of you, no one's putting a gun to your head. You can vote how you like. But they are unfair in that the situation is so heavily tilted, the playing field is so imbalanced, the incentive structures around you are so powerful and lead you towards the PAP, right? That by the time you get into the ballot box, you feel like you have very little choice. So you have gerrymandering, which of course the BN also heavily indulged in, malapportionment, right? which has been explained. But in Singapore, on top of that, we've got group representation constituencies, GRCs, multiple politicians running on a single slate, which makes it hugely difficult for the smaller opposition parties and enables the PAP to sneak in weaker candidates under the cover of a very strong minister. I mean, is there anyone here who lives in Jurong GRC? No? Yes? Which minister is in Jurong GRC? Right? Yes, Mr. Tharman, right? And so the PAP got 80% of the vote there in 2015, highest percentage across Singapore, right? So we all know who the ministers in Jurong GRC, but can you name the other 4 MPs in Jurong GRC off the top of your head? Yeah. Uh-huh. There's one more. That's very good, by the way. You're the only person I've met who's been able to... Sorry. I'm a Malaysian foreign worker residing and working in Singapore. Oh. Okay, so that explains. Even better, congratulations, that's really good. So you see my point, right? Most people don't know or don't care who the other 4 MPs are. Yeah? Oh, okay, right. So on top of this, right? So I mean, my point is there are only actually 29 constituencies in Singapore. 29, right? We have, what, 90, how many now? 98, 97, something. We have a lot of seats in Parliament. We only have 29 constituencies. So then you have the town councils, which are organizations created for the express purpose of punishing voters in wards which vote opposition. Right? Previously, before the 80s, all the public services were handled by the PUB. But then, because of the town councils, right, these were created so that and as Lee Kuan Yew specifically said, if a certain ward votes opposition, then they have to face the consequences of having their public services provided by the opposition, right? And in other words, you make people suffer for their vote. So the people of Aljunied and Hougang, they understand what I mean here because they elected opposition parties and their town councils have been embroiled in audits and lawsuits ever since. Whether the town council is actually able to make people's lives demonstrably worse is beside the point. The point is fear, right? The point is that when you elect an opposition politician, right, or before you elect an opposition politician, you want to think about, are my taps actually going to be turned off? Is the rubbish going to be collected? Is the streets going to get cleaned, right? And this fear in the minds of voters is what really then creates the incentive structure, the tilted playing field that I talked about. Right? So on top of that, of course, we have the attacks on opposition politicians, on activists. That increases the fear. We have the lack of a free media, lack of equal coverage during elections or even on a daily basis, lack of transparency about many processes, the huge constraints on campaign financing, but unequal enforcement of election law. In short, election rules heavily favor the government. And on top of this, you have a level of control, social, cultural control in Singapore that the BN government has never had, can never have. 80% of Singaporeans live in government-subsidized housing, right, the HDB. The government directly or indirectly owns around 85% of land. It controls 100% of the pension funds. All Singaporeans are tied into a capitalist system of wage labor. We have mortgages, we have taxes, we have monthly payments that we must pay. And you are going to be very worried about jeopardizing your inflow of income when you have so many bills to pay every month. All Singaporeans must study in one language. That doesn't exist here either. All male Singaporeans must do national service, right? So this gives the PAP power to reshape society to suit the party. And that is what they've done in their 50 years in power. Singapore, under the PAP, has become more conservative, more elitist, more quote-unquote Chinese, so to speak, since the 1970s, thanks to social policies by the PAP government. In other countries, you have governments which gerrymander, right? They choose their voters. That's kid stuff. In Singapore, the PAP has used its power to influence how the voters themselves think, to make them more likely to vote PAP. So, In other countries, and I assume also here in Malaysia, it's quite possible for you to escape this state capitalist infrastructure. You don't get an ID. You work in the informal economy. You take cash. You pay only cash. But you can't do that in Singapore. You need your IC for everything. You need your ID everywhere, right? And there's cameras everywhere. There's the ERP. It's very, very hard to escape the state apparatus. From the moment you're born, you have an ID number, and it follows you everywhere you go in Singapore for the rest of your life. And all of this combined together creates a fear of an overwhelming government, right? And this has real effects. A study by academics at the University of British Columbia actually asked voters, 3,000 voters in Singapore, did you change your vote out of fear at the last election? This is for 2011 and 2015. And they didn't ask which party you changed from and to. They just asked, did you change your vote out of fear, right? And they asked a whole bunch of other questions. And in short, to sum up, their conclusion was that fear is a genuine factor in how people vote in Singapore. At minimum, it changes the vote by a few percentage points. At maximum, they said it could be as high as 30% of Singaporeans change their vote out of fear. Now, this is an inexact science, which is why they created, such a broad range. But their conclusion was that if not for this fear, the PAP would have outright lost the 2011 election, and they would have lost their supermajority, 2/3 supermajority in 2015. So this fear creates a real change in Singapore and how people vote, right? So my point here, right, about all these structural factors is that Malaysia has never taken political control to the extremes that the Singapore government has. It's in the same direction, but Singapore, because of unique factors, the size of the country, the wealth of the country, the urban, development of the country, is able to go way further. So the political economy of social control is very different in Singapore. Singapore has been able to indulge in social engineering to a degree that is impossible in Malaysia. So that's structure, institutions. Let me talk about politics. And there are two key factors which I think we need to think about, which may seem similar in Malaysia and Singapore, but actually, if you think about them, can be quite different. So the first sort of factor in how the vote in May, right, the UMNO's BN's loss in May, was the result of a massive loss of faith by voters, right? Voters abandoned the party in droves. And why do people vote BN? How does it position itself politically? And in Malaysia, the positioning of BN has been very much about ideological politics, right? Positional politics. UMNO is a Malay nationalist party. It stands up for Malays. And that makes it vulnerable to challenge by other parties who try and claim this ground and say, we are more Malays. We are more Malay than you, right? This is not unique to Malaysia. There are plenty of nationalist parties all over the world. But this is the basis for UMNO's political dominance and its positioning as a political party was Malay nationalism. And they were challenged by many people, by Party Pribumi, that was composed of many people from UMNO and led by the man who wrote the Malay Dilemma, unimpeachable Malay nationalist credentials, right? So you combine that then with the corruption, 1MDB, and that severely undermined UMNO's position. So the question then is, what is the Singaporean equivalent? Because the PAP does not position itself ideologically per se. The PAP is a party which has successfully positioned itself not on ideology, but on this idea of competence, of performance. And that's the important issue in Singapore. And that is the issue on which it campaigns every election. So the issue that brings it down then is not going to be one, I feel, of values driven, right? it's going to be one which undermines its image of a competent government. Much like, for example, the immigration issue in 2011, which drove so much public anger. It could also be a massively incompetent response to a crisis, a public crisis, that destroys its reputation as a competent government. But the PAP has prepared for this. Why do they have such massive reserves? What do they need the money for, right? Shouldn't it be trying to use the money to improve the lives of Singaporeans? It's our money. They take it from us, they stash it away. Why? And one reason is because that reserve is a huge buffer. It enables the government to spend its way out of any problems, especially problems which might undermine its reputation for competence. So it has this big cash hoard that it can use. Whereas, for example, when Najib had his problems, then you started seeing him desperately trying to raise cash, right? And then there were all these questions asked about the sale of public assets. In Singapore, that doesn't need to happen. So, of course, corruption is another possibility for Singapore, right? And then, of course, there are other issues, the ministerial salaries, the hot-button topics, raise expectations for performance. But fundamentally, the Singapore government, the PAP, is positioned on competence. And so we need to think about that as the issue, the crucial issue on which its election is usually decided. And equally important, I think, is the rise of a second factor, which we've also discussed, the rise of an alternative to the government. In Malaysia, this was driven by a split in the ruling party's ranks. And without Anwar and without what happened to him in 1998, we don't have all these events which lead to May 2018. And some commentators have argued that this is the likeliest way that an alternative will happen in Singapore, right? I think Chairman George, for example, has argued this. A split in the PAP is the likeliest way forward for change. And okay, right, maybe that's entirely possible. But I'm not sure if that's the healthiest thing for Singapore. Just like I'm not sure if the current situation is the long-term the healthiest situation for Malaysia. So bear with me a bit on this. Okay, put it this way. Lee Kuan Yew once argued that the fall of UMNO was not the crucial thing for Malaysia. It would not be as earth-shaking as people think. Because what the Malaysian situation is predicated on is Malay elite supremacy, right? And if UMNO, it's all about the preservation of the status quo of the elite. And in that light, if UMNO turns into a liability, then another Malay elite party could come along and replace it. And that would preserve the status quo. And so, you know what? I mean, you guys know I don't like Lee Kuan Yew. Many people here, I'm sure, have strong opinions about him, but we all agree he was a very smart man about politics, especially politics in other people's countries. And so I think there's definitely something in that. If you think about who replaced UMNO and how they were replaced, how they were able to replace UMNO. Who led the main opposition to UMNO, right? The only man who's more unimpeachably Malay nationalist than them. The man who is most responsible for how Malaysia is today. And the question is, was he acting to take down a self-serving elite to create Malaysia Bahru? Or was he acting in defense of a self-serving elite against a prime minister which was jeopardizing the position of the elite? And that question, I feel, is not yet answered. It will take some time to answer for us to see what happens in Malaysia. And I have lots of hope, but I think this is a valid question. And in Singapore, we have a parallel situation. We have an elite who will act in defense of their privilege. Their composition, of course, is different from Malaysia, but Michael Barr did a good job of narrowing down their characteristics, right? Male, ethnic Chinese, English educated, scholarship holders, has military rank, right? You notice many of these characteristics in Singapore have been marketed, have come to be shorthand for, competence, intelligence. That's been the result of a sustained campaign to think of competence, performance, intelligence, elitism, merit in that way. But increasingly what we see in Singapore is that the PAP are prioritizing the preservation of the elite over competent government. We see people who meet these 5 characteristics, but they have very poor performance, and they don't get punished, they don't get held accountable, they get moved sideways with little accountability. The MRT, for example, the Transport Ministry, right? We've all complained endlessly and been caught in regular MRT breakdowns. And at the same time, the most competent and popular politician in Singapore is not allowed to be Prime Minister because he is the wrong race. He doesn't meet the qualifications for that elite. Instead, the next Prime Minister has to be a bunch of, one of a bunch of no-name, interchangeable Mandarins. And I use the word Mandarins deliberately there. And this is where I think the vulnerability to the PAP lies, right? As they increasingly prioritize protection of the elite over competence, as their elites pile up failures but avoid accountability, voters will detect this and punish them. But then if this results in a PAP split, we have to ask, is the PAP splitting to then overturn a flawed status quo? Or are they splitting and is the breakaway faction acting to defend the status quo against a PAP which now jeopardizes it? And so I don't think that's the healthiest way forward, because in the end you end up with the same unhealthy status quo. So we have an interesting situation right now in Singapore where the most popular or well-respected or leader of all 3 of the biggest parties is actually Indian, right? You've got Tharman, you've got Thum Singh, you've got Paul Tambaya. And if we go back in Singapore's history, right, we elected people regardless of language, race, or religion. Our first chief minister came from one of Singapore's smallest communities, David Marshall, a Jew. Our first opposition politician after independence was a Jaffna Tamil, J.B. Jeyaretnam. And this is really important for Singapore. I hope we preserve this willingness to elect the best, most competent people regardless of race, language, or religion. And that to me is the key difference when you ask me, can Singapore do a Malaysia? Well, I'm not sure I want to do a Malaysia, right? The victory of Mahathir is possibly, probably, maybe, an action to protect elite privilege, which is why he was able to defeat UMNO. And that's not really what I want for Singapore. I want a country, that, as I keep saying, elects the best regardless of race, language, or religion. Right? And people ask me, should Singapore follow a US model of democracy, Taiwan model, or a Korean, a German model? I say no. And if you ask me, should we follow a Malaysian model, I would also say no. We should follow a Singapore model. We are a country which had democracy, limited democracy, but democracy in the 50s and 60s. And we made good choices with our vote. We elected David Marshall. And then later, when he failed to fulfill his campaign promise, he resigned out of principle. He is the only Malayan leader to ever resign out of principle. You think about it, right? All the others have basically been forced out for various reasons. Marshall resigned because he wasn't able to keep his promise to the voters. We got Lim Yew Hock, who was not a good chief minister, and so we kicked him out in 1959 in favor of an untested opposition party, a leader who had never held elected office. We elected an untried, untested opposition party, and it turns out they have been, for all their faults, pretty good for Singapore. So this willingness to take risks and elect the best, that is the Singapore I want to follow, our own past. So in sum, right, to conclude, I don't actually want Singapore to do a Malaysia. I want Singapore to do a Singapore. Thank you very much.